Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who is joining us for this briefing after China's human rights review, which concluded just an hour ago here in Geneva. My name is Iona Liddell. I'm the Executive Director of Tibet Justice Centre, and I've also been working throughout the last 10 months towards the human rights review with a coalition, an international coalition of Tibet groups called the International Tibet Network. In the 4 years since its last review, the Chinese government has failed to substantially improve human rights conditions. Indeed, the situation in Tibet, particularly, has dramatically deteriorated since 2009 and continues on a rapid downward spiral. The build-up to the review has been catastrophic in Tibet. Earlier this month, Chinese security forces shot and wounded at least 60 Tibetans in central Tibet when Chinese forces opened fire on a crowd who had gathered to appeal for the release of a fellow villager who had objected to a government order for all Tibetan homes and monasteries to raise the Chinese flag. This comes in the context of an incredibly intense patriotic re-education program which has been rolled out across Tibetan areas by the Chinese government in the last few years, which the Tibetans are resisting in all ways that they can. To coincide with its human rights review, China released a white paper that reiterated its very hardline and frankly outdated attack on the Dalai Lama and his supposed clique. Very unconstructive. The review presented a significant opportunity for UN member states to address the rapidly declining situation in Tibet and other issues across China by making constructive calls for positive changes in China's failing policies. As a coalition of 185 Tibetan organizations, as I said, we've spent a long time, the past 10 months, urging states to take this opportunity to stand for Tibet. It's been an intense time. Tensions have been very high prior to the review, as China has tried very hard to keep Tibet and other core human rights issues off the agenda. Its bullying tactics extended beyond Tibet, beyond Xinjiang, beyond China, to international civil society, governments, and even within the UN. NGOs have had to work especially hard to counter this. We've been urging states to ensure that rather than playing to China's interests, the review must have at its heart the people whose rights are being systematically violated under Chinese rule. As such, issues like Tibet become a litmus test for how robust the UPR mechanism is. Raising issues such as the situation in Tibet is incredibly important, not only for the Tibetans suffering these injustices and violations under Chinese rule, but it also has a secondary benefit because it strengthens overall the UN human rights UPR review system. Looking at the bigger picture, the timing of this review is absolutely key. China, despite its abysmal human rights record, will be attempting to gain a seat, or regain a seat, on the UN Human Rights Council on November 12th. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion here today, and I think it's probably time now to move on to our other speakers to find out their thoughts about this. I'd like to introduce them. We are very lucky to be joined by some very key speakers. We have Pema Doma, who is the Europe and Campaigns Director for Students for Free Tibet. We have Julie de Rivero, who is the Geneva Director of Human Rights Watch. And we have Yang Jianli, who is the President of Initiatives for China. I would now like to hand over to Pema Doma for her input, analysis, general thoughts on today's review.
As my colleague Iona mentioned, we've been here in Geneva now for many months, highlighting China's flagrant human rights violations, which continue to take place right now across Tibet. As a Tibetan, I commend the UN member states who put China in the hot seat today and use this important multilateral forum to spotlight and condemn China's failed policies in Tibet that have driven a shocking 122 Tibetans to light their own bodies on fire in protest since 2009, the year of China's last review at the Human Rights Council. We especially commend Canada, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, Poland, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America for their verbal interventions on Tibet, along with robust statements from other states about the protection of ethnic minorities. We extend our appreciation to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, included Tibet in their written questions submitted in advance. The timing of the recommendations for China from so many member states on issues that directly relate to Tibet could not be more urgent, because even as I speak, entire towns and villages in central Tibet are under siege for opposing and renewed patriotic re-education that Tibetans say is reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. Just this month, at least 60 Tibetans were injured when Chinese forces opened fire on a crowd peacefully appealing for the release of fellow villager who had objected to a government order for all Tibetan homes and monasteries to raise the Chinese flag. Member states' questions and recommendations, especially those from the Czech Republic, Germany, and the US, conveyed strong international criticism of China's heavy-handed policies and a real desire to see drastic improvements to the human rights situation in Tibet. We intend to work with member states moving toward to ensure their recommendations address our areas of top concern in Tibet. Ending the use of political and patriotic re-education and removing work teams from Tibetan monasteries, nunneries, and settlements. Suspending the non-voluntary resettlement of nomadic herders from their traditional lands, as recommended by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate food. Both of these issues have been exacerbating factors in the self-immolations crisis that has claimed the lives of more than 100 Tibetans over the last 2 years: monks, nuns, young Tibetans, elderly Tibetans, mothers, and nomads. What was not surprising today, but deeply troubling, was the Chinese government's outright lies and blatant attempt to deflect criticism about the human rights situation in Tibet. China's verbal response to questions about Tibet was aggressively hardline, and its condemnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his clique was echoed by China's neatly timed white paper on Tibet. As a Tibetan, I am horrified that China's new leadership has not moved on from such an antediluvian and insulting attitude towards His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who, as we speak, is meeting with other Nobel Peace Prize laureates in Warsaw. To address the obvious disconnect between the reality on the ground in Tibet and the picture presented by the Chinese spokespeople, member states now need to hold China accountable for implementing the recommendations put forward today. We hope member states will urgently advocate China follow through on its commitment to grant the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights access to Tibet, with an assurance that there be no restrictions on travel to Tibetan areas. Now, China's response today on Tibet was not what was required of a state deserving re-election to the United Nations Human Rights Council. We call on UN member states to oppose China's re-election to the Human Rights Council, as Chinese activist and dissident Hu Jie recently told Sky News. Allowing China to become a member of the UN Human Rights Council is like making an executioner a judge. That is ridiculous. We urge governments not to allow China to continue to erode the integrity of the Human Rights Council. Governments should not vote for China on the 12th of November. My colleague Yang Jianli will speak in more detail on this campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pema. I would like to now invite Julie Rivero from Human Rights Watch to give her comments and analysis on the review and perhaps also wider connects with what might be happening next.
Well, I thought it was very interesting. China's already had one review 4 years ago, and this was their second review. And in a way, what was interesting is that there was a broader number of states and a more diverse group of states that really raised key human rights concerns about the situation in China, particularly freedom of expression inside China and the rights of human rights defenders to do their human rights work and to do so with respect of their freedom of association. So many countries raised these issues across the board, and China was unable to stack the participants or the governments that were going to speak this time round. So I think we saw a much more rich exchange of governments with China. It was also very clear that governments around the world are concerned about China's use of the death penalty and the lack of transparency in its use, and there were many calls for China to put an end to the use of the death penalty. Of course, as was mentioned before, religious freedom was one of the key issues that was raised both for Tibet and Xinjiang, but generally speaking, persecution of religious minorities was mentioned across the board. I think it was enraging that China presented itself as very progressive in terms of its engagement with NGOs and talking about NGOs participating in the UPR process. The reality is that independent NGOs were not able to participate in this process inside China, and that activists that were asking for this space have been severely repressed, have been interrogated, and one of them is disappeared today because she wanted to participate in this process, Kao Shun Li. But many governments had heard China talk about NGO participation and congratulated China for that. So I think at NGOs we really need to set the record straight that this NGO participation was not of independent NGOs, but mainly NGOs that are created by China itself to pretend that such exchange exists inside China. I think another interesting fact was how China has used its human rights action plan as something that it can sell to governments to praise. Obviously, this human rights action plan is not intended to actually promote change or implementation on the ground, and doesn't actually serve Chinese citizens to transform the situation on the ground, but really serves these purposes, that is, for China to try and present a cleaner a view of itself and its human rights record in forums such as the UN. But overall, I would say that there was a much more diverse and robust engagement around China's review, and that China was put on the hot seat, as was said, on many different issues.
Thank you very much, Julie, for that analysis. I'd like to now pass over to my colleague Yang Jianli from Initiatives for China. Yang Jianli, please tell us what you thought.
Hello, everyone. I was sitting in today's meeting, UPR meeting. I was amazed once again by Chinese government ability to tell such blatant lies with straight face. And they basically continued the old rhetorics. The rhetorics actually are very important because this is an indicator that they have no willingness to improve the field policies, 60 years field policies in Tibet and in other fields of human rights in China. And this is just another example how China is disqualified for the membership on the Human Rights Council. And today I speak as a citizen of China. I'm not just a foreigner to interfere with the internal affairs. And China, in the course of its affairs as great nation, has left large fingerprints on the canvas of human events. With regard to human rights, these fingerprints place China on a scene of so many activities, both domestic and international, that are so outside the norm of civilized nations that its membership on the UN Human Rights Council just defies logic, reason, and common sense. In considering China's human rights record, which today shows once again does not want to improve, we need to look no further than the Tibetans, the group of Tibetans, ethnic group of Tibetans, who have received unspeakable sufferings at the hands of this regime. We need to look no further than these individuals, groups, policies, events. Tiananmen massacre, Tiananmen mothers, Liu Xiaobo, and his wife Liu Xia, Wang Bingzhang, as we speak, is languishing in prison for life imprisonment. And Dang Dup Wangqin, Harriet Nayes, and Hada, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, forced evictions, forced abortions, forced disappearance, black jails. So for this record, once again, Chinese government this morning showed no willingness to improve. So today we should declare that it is wrong to allow China to sit on the UN Human Rights Council. Just as Pam mentioned, my friend and colleague Hu Jia put it, allowing China to become a member on the Human Rights Council is just like putting a murderer on the seat of the judge. And under the current rule, China needs 97 votes on December 12th at the UN General Assembly to become a member again. If every democracy says no to China, China would not stand any chance. So the vote, the very vote on November 12th, actually is a test of any democracy's commitment to democracy and human rights. So here I call on all democracies not to humiliate your great country and your great people and choose a no vote on China. Yes, I said humiliation. It is humiliating for democracy to stop the murderer from sitting on the seat of the judge when they can. It is humiliating to the great country and the great people when they think it is okay to have a country to sit on the Human Rights Council, which does not even allow the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be freely distributed in its country. So today I call again on the democracies to cast the vote. The vote will be go down in the history. And also I call on all the groups that directly involved China to work hand in hand to wage a war, an open war against the dictatorship in United Nations. And eventually, I think we will win this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang Jinli, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think some very interesting points there. Yes, a change from 2009's Human Rights Review, more of a diverse and robust engagement, as Julie mentioned, but still significant concerns looking at the bigger picture in terms of China's continued engagement on human rights platforms at the international level. I'd like to now take questions from our online audience. We also have a physical audience in front of us. So I think the first question we have is directed, I think we could direct this to Julie. This is from Frank Langford from NPR in Shanghai. He asked Julie what she thinks the chances are that China will get on the UN Human Rights Council and what the effect of that would be.
Well, unfortunately, I think China has quite a high probability of getting elected onto the Human Rights Council. There are other candidates within the Asian group that are competing for seats. Some of them have equally troubling human rights records, for instance, Saudi Arabia. But China has quite a high chance of getting onto the Human Rights Council because of its influence around the world. And in a way, that's what we saw today in the UPR review. China is able to write the talking points of many governments in terms of their interventions and what they were saying during the review. praising China on areas of progress and refraining from raising any criticisms or concerns about China's human rights record. The effects, of course, will be damaging in the sense that China, through its past membership, has questioned the UN Human Rights Council engagement on any country situation, even though this is something that is explicit in the mandate of the Human Rights Council. That's to say that the Human Rights Council was created to react to situations of human rights violations around the world and to respond promptly. And China has systematically rejected all initiative within the Human Rights Council to respond to situations, whether it's Syria or whether it's on Sri Lanka or whether it's in a place like North Korea. So it's very damaging to the Human Rights Council when member states that are revisionist about its mandate come and occupy membership in the council. Also, of course, China has a very regressive stance on NGO participation and speaking rights, and therefore it's when China is a member, it tries to support initiatives that have the objective of restricting NGO participation. So I would say overall it's not looking good for China's membership.
Thank you. We have another question related. Somebody is keen to know, why is it specifically that China wants to have a seat on the council, and what the Chinese government angle is on this, what it benefits them to be on it? I don't know if Yang Zhangli, you might like to talk to that.
So today I want to say something else first. Today I first heard the interpretation of Xi Jinping's dream, one interpretation that I have never heard. That is the dream of human rights from the mouth of China's ambassador, Wu Hailong. But we have to remember, this is an international setting. We do not talk about in China. So legitimacy, they have a legitimacy problem in China. So any membership, any so-called legitimacy they can gain from an international organization will be used in turn to mobilize the people in China. Given the situation in China where people have a very strong sense of patriotism. So they use all this kind of international status for the domestic politics purpose. So that's why they make every effort to try to gain this membership. And as I said earlier, surely a member of United Human Rights Council must subscribe in practice as well as in principle to the rights outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But unfortunately, China has failed to pass the minimal test that I proposed a few years ago. I said earlier in my statement, that is, the member of United Nations Human Rights Council must allow this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, be freely distributed in China. Can I go to Tiananmen Square to distribute the copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Of course I can't. Can my Tibetan brothers and sisters distribute this document in Lhasa? They can't. So this is a minimal test. They have repeatedly failed. And any member sitting on the council is supposed to defend and protect the principles outlined in that document, which cannot be freely distributed in China. I just want to remind everybody this very basic fact.
Thank you, Yang Zhenli. Very interesting response to that question. Another question's coming in. Obviously, China's been on the Human Rights Council before, so why is its re-election of so much concern? Maybe Yang, you can, Zhenli, you can speak to that briefly to explain.
Failure to gain this seat would be a direct flag on the face of Xi Jinping, because he just assumed this leadership. So this regime will do everything possible to gain this seat for sure. And in China, we, just a month ago, we launched a signature campaign to oppose China's membership. And this campaign are targeted on the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Chinese. This is so, the groups directly involved with China. We cannot say these are Chinese or Chinese citizens, but these are groups directly involved with China. Those groups who have every right to say what they think China should be on the council or not. So far we have been able to collect 5,500 signatures with real names. Given the situation in China, this is a big success. So we try to do everything to let the voice be heard in the international community. The voice for the reasons that we all know have been muffled and for many years. And so we know from day one this is an uphill battle, but we need to remind the international community that as human being, the entire mankind, we need a universal standard. We need a universal standard for justice. Without that, this world would be continue the way, in the way that the human rights and the lives of people are constantly in danger. So if we want to make the world better, we must have a universal standard. This standard must be applied to all the countries, no matter how strong this country is. China is a powerful nation, but we cannot apply different human rights standards to different countries. We understand because of the real politique in the international community, we are fighting an uphill battle. But this discussion is valuable. It will eventually contribute to the reform of United Nations. So the question we pose to United Nations is that if a government does not represent their people, these violators of the human rights of their people, who do they represent in United Nations? So the international community must answer this question. I know it's difficult to answer, but we have to face this question.
Thank you very much, Zhenli. We have another question that's come in just now from the organization Avaz. I'd like to direct this question to Pema Dolma from the Students for Free Tibet and the wider Tibetan movement. Avaz asks, what do you think the next steps are post this human rights review, the UPR review? What should we be doing to get ready for this UNHCR vote on 12th November? And obviously, Zhenli has spoken about his petition campaign and how that's a way that he's taking forward this momentum of multilateral, encouraging multilateral engagement on serious issues related to China's human rights concerns. But what can the rest of us be doing? Other things to get ready for this vote?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think it also relates to what Daniela asked, and in a way also what Frank has been asking. It's very interesting, these questions, because I mean, likewise with the Human Rights Council vote, and happening after the UPR, China's UPR, I feel it's very much still something about awareness and lobbying that can be done. The Human Rights Council vote itself, the fact that there is a vote to begin with is a historic improvement, because that only happened in 2006, that there was actually a vote, and before members didn't even have to be voted in. So it's an improvement, but the message is that China is not fulfilling the standards to be on this council. And in a similar way, what we have done with the UPR is we have been lobbying our governments, our foreign ministries, our permanent missions in Geneva and around the world, really related to political and multilateral mechanisms. And in the same way, I believe this is something that can be done both on national, international, and very local grassroots levels, that people can take action, is to really inform our policymakers, whether they're in the parliament, in the foreign ministry, or at the UN, to inform them about what is happening and urge them to hold China accountable based on the pledges that they have made in regards to the UPR, but also the pledges that they have made in relation to the Human Rights Council vote, because there are a lot of pledges that they made, and so it would be very interesting to see if we can lobby our governments and our policymakers to press China to give evidence, data, and more insight as to what they have been doing in order to ensure that they deserve a seat on the Human Rights Council, and that they deserve to and that they have acted in recommendation with the UPR process. And that's something that we all can do. That's something that, as a Tibet Lobby Coalition, we have been doing for many, many months. And today we can see the success that we've had with a lot of member states. So I definitely feel that something can be done on a national, international, and a very grassroots level, likewise.
Thank you very much, Pema. A question for Julie. We saw that 13 states raised the issue of Tibet, whether in recommendations or within their advanced questions and statements. We all know that this is not a topic that the Chinese government is interested in addressing or hearing about. What do you think will be the likely reaction to these recommendations? Is there any chance they'll be accepted, some of them, in some sort of move to look conciliatory? What's your take on that?
Well, I think the Chinese government is clearly in denial when it comes to Tibet, and they clearly showed during the review that they're not willing to take any responsibility for the deterioration of the situation inside Tibet, and that they preferred, rather than addressing the real problems, to equate human rights activism in Tibet to terrorism or criminal activity. So I think that we can expect the Chinese government to be very defensive about the Tibet situation and about the recommendations that relate to Tibet, and it's unfortunate because really there is space for dialogue, and this is what is pushing people to such extremes. The fact that there seems to be so little options for a reasonable discussion with the Chinese authorities. But I think some governments didn't raise Tibet specifically, but they did speak about the persecution of minorities and religious groups. And I think, by doing so, they were also referring to the general climate inside China for Tibetans and for others. I think that a better situation would have been China accepting that it needs to enter into a proper dialogue and address some of the grievances. But obviously this is not the position that they've adopted. And I think they're not likely to change that in the near future.
Thank you for that. I think, I think you're right. There's not much sign of that in the near future, but I think we've been encouraged and emboldened as a Tibet movement by the response of so many more states than at the last review. We would say that almost 100% increase on the numbers who decided to stand up for Tibet and took that on as an issue. Of course, now looking forward, there's another 4 years until China will be reviewed again at the UN, but in the interim period, I think that all of us are going to be working towards getting to that point, wherever it is in the future, where China is forced or comes to the table to engage meaningfully on these issues. And for now, I think that the sights are on the Human Rights Council vote, and really the questioning substantially the legitimacy of having a state with such a bad, terrible, shocking human rights record, to have the right in some ways to join that International Human Rights Forum. So I would just like to thank very much all our speakers. I don't know if anybody has anything they would like to add at this point. Yeah, please do, Julie.
Yeah, just to follow on from that and maybe just add some closing points. I think you're right. I mean, it was impressive the number of states that raised issues on Tibet and general human rights concerns. And I think however hard China tries to cover up the realities on the ground, in our interdependent world now, it's impossible to hide those realities. And the situations speak for themselves. So China will continue to come under pressure to deliver on its human rights promises and to open up and give access. I think a lot of the recommendations on Tibet were about access and giving UN special mechanisms and the UN High Commissioner access, which I think was another big topic. Many governments encouraged China to be more transparent in its engagement with the United Nations. And really, I think one of the biggest problems with China becoming a member of the Human Rights Council is its repression of human rights activists, including those that try and use the system here in Geneva. And, I don't think there is any other government that has disappeared an activist that wanted to engage with the UPR. And this is really a chilling way of sending a clear message to all activists that they will be punished for trying to use the UN system and talking about China. But I think there are a lot of voices there that are willing to speak out, many governments that are willing to look at the realities on the ground. Others made perhaps more, not such strong statements, but they were strong nonetheless, considering all the pressure they must have got and received from China in the wake of the UPR. So I think that overall it's encouraging that the world recognizes the terrible challenges inside China and that they were actually taken up during the review.
Thank you. I think that was a wonderful way to end this discussion, and I look forward to working together, all of us, as we move forward, encouraging states to continue that robust engagement and to strengthen it. I think I would like to thank our panel once more and wrap this up. Thank you all who have joined us. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and we'll be online at another place at the next event, probably around the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much. Thanks.